June 4th, 1942, the Aleutian Islands, Alaska. Fog rolled low across the tundra as 5 Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zeros soared through the gray skies, engines howling like steel ghosts. Their mission was simple: destroy a small outpost near Dutch Harbor and vanish back into the mist. But fate had other plans. One Zero, piloted by Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, just 20 years old, took a bullet through his oil line during the raid. Black smoke poured from his engine as he veered toward a Kutan Island, hoping to make an emergency landing. His comrades never saw him again. The moment his wheels hit the marshy ground, the fighter flipped violently, killing him instantly. His plane lay half-buried, untouched by fire, waiting in silence for discovery. 5 weeks later, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina patrol spotted something gleaming in the bog. When engineers arrived, they realized what they had: the first intact Japanese Zero ever captured. It was a treasure more valuable than gold, the key to understanding Japan's deadliest weapon. What came next would alter the balance of air power in the Pacific. That wreck would give birth to the F6F Hellcat, the fighter that would shred Japan's air superiority with an impossible 19-to-1 kill ratio. 1 dead pilot, 1 captured plane, and a secret that would help America dominate the skies. If you're fascinated by how a single accident reshaped the entire Pacific War, stay tuned, because this is the story of how one test pilot turned a captured Zero into a killing machine. July 10th, 1942, a Kutan Island, Alaska. A U.S. Navy PBY Catalina patrol plane cut through the mist above the Aleutians. Below, the tundra looked empty, a lifeless expanse of fog and marsh. But then, one of the crewmen spotted something that didn't belong. A flash of metal, a curve of wings. The pilot banked hard for a closer look. There, half sunk in the bog, lay an aircraft unlike any they'd seen before. Sleek, pale gray, intact, painted with the crimson circle of the rising sun. The Americans could hardly believe it. An enemy Zero fighter, seemingly untouched by fire or crash. Word shot through the Navy chain of command like electricity. Within days, a recovery team landed on the island under harsh winds and freezing rain. What they found was miraculous. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, flown by Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, still largely undamaged. His body was gently buried nearby, but his aircraft, they realized, was a once-in-a-war prize. Until that moment, the Zero had been a phantom. American pilots whispered about it in terror, a plane that could outclimb, outturn, and outfight anything they flew. The Navy knew almost nothing about its construction, materials, or limitations. Every encounter ended the same way: American aircraft burning in the sky. The engineers worked for days to free the sunken fighter from the mud. They disassembled the wings, drained the fuselage, and carefully loaded the pieces onto a barge for transport to Dutch Harbor. From there, the Zero was shipped south, traveling through the ports of Alaska, Seattle, and eventually San Diego, guarded like a national secret. By August 1942, the plane arrived at Naval Air Station North Island in California. Crews meticulously cleaned it, replaced damaged parts, and restored it to flying condition. For the first time, an American mechanic ran his hand along the smooth, lightweight skin of Japan's most feared weapon, amazed at its craftsmanship and simplicity. The Zero weighed barely 5,500 pounds, yet could fly over 330 miles per hour and climb at nearly 4,000 feet per minute. Its agility was unmatched. It could roll, dive, and twist through the air like a bird. But the Americans also noticed something else: no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero was built for speed and maneuverability, but not survival. That realization lit a fire in the minds of U.S. engineers. If they could understand how this machine worked, and more importantly, where it failed, they could design the weapon that would destroy it. In early September, the Navy assigned one of its best test pilots, Lieutenant Eddie R. Sanders, to take the restored aircraft into the air. On September 20th, 1942, the captured Zero lifted off under American control for the first time. It was the beginning of a revolution. As the wheels left the runway, Sanders' voice crackled over the radio. "She flies beautifully, but she's fragile. If we can get inside her weaknesses, the game changes." That single flight marked a turning point in the Pacific. What began as a crash in the Alaskan tundra was now the U.S. Navy's most valuable secret. The Japanese called it the Akutan Zero. The Americans called it opportunity. July 10, 1942, Akutan Island, Alaska. The Aleutians were a place few men wanted to see twice. A chain of volcanic islands, battered by endless wind and fog. They were the edge of the world, the forgotten frontier of World War II. Here, the air smelled of salt and death, and even the seabirds flew low to the ground. On that gray morning, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina patrol aircraft skimmed just above the mist, its twin engines humming against the vast silence of the North Pacific. The crew wasn't expecting anything more than another long, monotonous patrol over freezing seas. But then, one of the lookouts shouted, pointing at something glinting in the marsh below. "Metal there, dead ahead." The Catalina banked sharply. Through the fog, a strange shape emerged, half-buried silver-gray, with perfect curved wings. When it got closer, the crew realized what they were looking at. The crimson circle of the rising sun was faint but unmistakable. Lying nose down in the bog was an enemy Zero fighter, perfectly intact. The crew's radio messages hit the Navy's chain of command like a lightning bolt. An intact Japanese aircraft, not wrecked, not burned, but nearly flyable, had been found on American soil. For months, American pilots had faced Japan's mysterious Mitsubishi A6M Zero in the skies over the Pacific, and they were being slaughtered. From the Philippines to Wake Island to the Coral Sea, the Zero had proven nearly unbeatable. It could turn inside any Allied aircraft, climb faster, and outfly everything the U.S. Navy had. Its performance seemed almost supernatural, as if Japan had unlocked the secret to flight itself. Pilots whispered the same chilling phrase: "If you see a Zero on your tail, pray." But now, by pure chance, the U.S. had something far greater than luck. They had the enemy's best-kept secret. Within days, a recovery team was sent to Akutan Island. The mission wasn't simple. The Zero had crashed into a marshland so soft that men sank up to their knees with every step. There were no roads, no docks, just a bog of black mud, fog, and silence. When the recovery crew arrived, they found the fighter almost completely intact. Its propeller was twisted, and its landing gear had collapsed, but the fuselage was solid, the wings straight, and the engine nearly undamaged. The pilot, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, a 20-year-old aviator from Japan's elite Air Corps, still sat in the cockpit. His neck had broken instantly when the aircraft flipped on landing. He was buried nearby with military respect under the cold Alaskan sky. But his airplane, that was another matter. The Americans knew they were looking at a treasure worth more than any weapon. Working in freezing rain, the team disassembled the Zero piece by piece. The process took days, cutting through frozen mud, draining water, and carefully hauling the lightweight aluminum sections onto wooden sleds. They used planks and ropes to drag the fuselage across the bog to the nearest point of transport. There were no cranes, no vehicles, only manpower and determination. At last, the aircraft was loaded onto a barge bound for Dutch Harbor, then transported south through Alaska's ports, onto a ship for Seattle, and finally by train to Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego, California. Every step of the journey was guarded under the highest secrecy. When the Zero finally arrived, Navy engineers and Grumman aircraft designers were stunned. For the first time, they could study Japan's legendary warplane up close. The Mitsubishi A6M Type Zero Model 21 was nothing short of an engineering marvel. Weighing barely 5,500 pounds, it was nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than the American F6F Wildcat. Its wings were wide and beautifully contoured, its fuselage smooth and streamlined. The controls were light and responsive. The plane could climb to 20,000 feet in under 7 minutes and fly over 330 miles per hour on a single 940 horsepower Sakai radial engine. But beneath that beauty lay fatal flaws. The American technicians noticed almost immediately. No armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and thin aluminum skin. The Zero's agility came at a terrible price. It was fast but fragile, deadly but delicate. A single bullet through its fuel line could turn it into a fireball. That discovery changed everything. By late August, the U.S. Navy knew what had to be done. They assigned the captured aircraft to one of their best test pilots, Lieutenant Eddie R. Sanders, stationed at NAS North Island. His task, to fly the Zero, analyze its behavior, and report every strength and weakness. September 20th, 1942. A warm California morning. Mechanics rolled the Silver Fighter out of the hangar, its rising sun insignia now replaced with U.S. markings for safety. Sanders climbed into the cockpit, a mix of excitement and disbelief. Here he was, about to fly the very machine that had dominated the Pacific. When the propeller spun and the engine roared to life, the sound was unlike any American aircraft. Higher-pitched, lighter, almost eager. The Zero leapt off the runway effortlessly, and Sanders was immediately struck by its grace. "She handles beautifully," he radioed, "but she's twitchy, too light on the stick. No armor, no forgiveness." He pushed it to the limit, rolling, diving, climbing. The Zero responded like an extension of his own body. But as he pushed further, its flaws became clear. At high speeds, the controls stiffened. The engine overheated easily. In dives, it lost stability. Sanders knew this was the blueprint they needed. Over the next 24 test flights, Sanders and his team documented every aspect of the aircraft: turn rates, roll limits, fuel efficiency, stall speeds. Grumman engineers studied his notes carefully, incorporating each observation into their newest prototype, the F6F Hellcat. By the end of September, Sanders' final report concluded: "The Zero is a remarkable aircraft, but it is vulnerable. If engaged with superior firepower and speed, it can be beaten. The key is to never turn with it, dive, attack, and climb away." That tactical insight, hit fast, don't dogfight, would save countless American lives in the months to come. The U.S. now had both the knowledge and the inspiration to create something deadlier. An aircraft strong enough to withstand hits, fast enough to outpace the Zero, and armed enough to tear through its fragile frame. The stage was set for the rise of the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a fighter born directly from the captured Akutan Zero. That wreck in Alaskan Bog had given the Allies their first real chance at air superiority in the Pacific. And while Japan celebrated its early victories, American engineers were quietly building the weapon that would reverse the tide of war. One pilot's crash, one engineer's obsession, one plane that turned the tide. September 20th, 1942, Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego. The morning sun shimmered across the Pacific as Lieutenant Eddie R. Sanders climbed into the cockpit of the world's most coveted war prize, the captured Japanese Zero. Around him, engineers, photographers, and naval officers stood in silence, watching history take flight. The airfield's loudspeakers crackled to life. Akutan Zero, test flight number 1. Proceed. The radial engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared alive, the same Sakai 12 engine that had ruled Pacific skies for over a year. As the Zero taxied forward, its narrow landing gear wobbled slightly, a reminder of the precision and fragility of Japanese engineering. Then, with a rush of power, it lifted gracefully into the sky. What happened over the next hour changed everything. For the first time, an American pilot felt what Japanese aces had experienced since Pearl Harbor. The Zero's control stick was feather-light. It turned as if weightless, banking with the gentlest touch. Sanders reported later, "It's like flying silk, smooth, effortless, but you feel it'll tear if you pull too hard." At 10,000 feet, he pushed the nose down into a dive. Immediately, the stick stiffened violently. The aircraft began to tremble, almost refusing to respond. Sanders realized what no American had known before. At speeds over 250 knots, the Zero became sluggish, a victim of its own aerodynamic design. That single discovery would save lives. Back on the ground, he delivered his first report to the assembled engineers from Grumman and the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics. They hung on every word. The Zero's unbeatable below 250 knots. Above that, it locks up. If our pilots can dive out of fight, they'll survive. Never turn with it. Use gravity, use speed, and hit hard. The room fell silent. The Zero, once seen as an invincible predator, now had its first weakness exposed. Over the next 6 weeks, Sanders flew 24 test missions. Each one was meticulously recorded. Fuel efficiency, turn radius, climb rate, roll recovery, dive limits. Engineers examined the aircraft after every flight, measuring the stress on its frame and noting its fragile systems. They found that the Japanese had built the Zero for one purpose: to win the first strike. It was not meant for drawn-out combat. The airframe was made of an aluminum alloy, so light it could bend under stress. The fuel tanks lacked armor. One tracer round could ignite the plane in seconds. Sanders' team summarized it perfectly in their report. The Zero sacrifices everything for maneuverability, armor, durability, even survivability. This revelation spread through the Navy like wildfire. Pilots were retrained with a new philosophy. Don't dogfight. Boom and zoom. Dive. Fire. Climb away. That would become the mantra of the Pacific Air War. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away on Long Island, engineers at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation were already working on their next design, the F6F Hellcat. They had seen the Navy's growing losses with the outdated F4F Wildcat. The Zero had outclassed it in nearly every performance metric. But now, thanks to Sanders' flight data, Grumman's designers had a roadmap, a chance to build a fighter that could not only match the Zero, but obliterate it. The Hellcat was meant to be everything the Zero wasn't. It was big, heavy, and rugged. The airframe was built from armor-plated steel, with self-sealing fuel tanks, and powered by the mighty 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. Its 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns could deliver over 100 rounds per second, enough firepower to tear through an enemy formation in seconds. Test flights began in early 1943. Navy pilots immediately noticed the difference. The Hellcat could take a hit, several hits, and still bring its pilot home. One test pilot famously said, "It flies like a Wildcat on steroids." Grumman's engineers called the aircraft their Ironworks masterpiece. And in a twist of poetic irony, the aircraft that taught America how to build it, the captured Zero, sat just miles away at North Island, stripped and studied like an open book. In February 1943, the first production F6F 3 Hellcats rolled off the line. By August 31st, the first combat mission was launched from the USS Essex, striking targets on Marcus Island. The Japanese defenders scrambled their Zeros, the same model Koga had flown, and for the first time, the results were different. Hellcats tore through the formation, shooting down enemy planes with surgical precision. Pilots reported how the Zero would twist and turn desperately, try to shake them. But the Hellcat simply powered through, faster in a climb, deadlier in a dive, and impervious to glancing hits. The U.S. Navy had finally found its answer. Back in California, Sanders and his team were preparing their final evaluations. By then, the Akutan Zero had flown its last test. On February 26, 1945, the aircraft, its job complete, was destroyed in a landing accident at North Island. The irony was painful. The very machine that had once terrorized the Pacific now lay wrecked again, this time by its former enemy. But its legacy lived on. By mid-1943, the Hellcat had entered full-scale service. In the skies over Tarawa, Truk Lagoon, and the Marianas, it dominated every encounter. The lessons learned from the Akutan Zero were paying off in blood and victory. Pilots no longer feared the Crimson Circle. They hunted it. From a technical perspective, the transformation was staggering. The Hellcat's maximum speed of 380 miles per hour outclassed the Zero by 50 miles per hour. Its roll rate at high speed remained stable, where the Zero froze. Its climb rate nearly matched Japan's best, but it could sustain far more damage. The once invincible Zero now found itself hopelessly outmatched. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the most respected pilots of the Imperial Navy, later admitted, "The new American fighters, they could absorb bullets that would shatter our Zeros." The balance had changed completely. In less than a year, the power dynamic in the Pacific sky had flipped. But beyond the numbers, the emotional shift was even greater. The Hellcat didn't just give American pilots a weapon, it gave them confidence. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, they felt the odds tipping in their favor. They knew that if they flew smart, if they followed Sanders' reports and the tactics born from the Akutan Zero, they could come home alive. The myth of the unbeatable Japanese pilot began to crumble. By late 1943, the Hellcat was credited with over 3,000 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with minimal losses. By the end of the war, that number would climb past 5,000, a 19-to-1 kill ratio unmatched by any other fighter in history. And at the center of that legacy stood a single accident. One young Japanese pilot, one captured Zero, and one test pilot who refused to see it as just a trophy. What began as a tragedy on a lonely island in the Aleutians became the blueprint for victory in the Pacific. The Akutan Zero didn't just crash, it changed the course of the war. August 31st, 1943. The Pacific dawn broke crimson over the USS Essex, its deck alive with movement. Sailors scrambled across steel catwalks, fueling, arming, and inspecting the Navy's newest predator, the F6F Hellcat. Below decks, in the ready room, pilots sat silent as the mission briefing began. The target, Marcus Island, a remote Japanese outpost bristling with anti-aircraft guns and Zero fighters. For the first time, these men were not flying Wildcats. They were flying the machine forged from the wreck of Koga Zero, the fighter born from the Akutan Miracle. When the flight deck officer gave the signal, engines roared to life. Propellers blurred into spinning discs. The carrier itself seemed to tremble as the first Hellcat rolled forward. "Launch the Hellcats!" With that command, the Pacific War entered a new phase. From a moment the first F6Fs left the deck, American pilots felt the difference. The Hellcat accelerated like a charging bull, its powerful Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine shoving the plane forward with sheer brute force. It was not elegant. It was unstoppable. As the formation climbed toward Marcus Island, the sky shimmered with the morning sun, and then the enemy appeared. Tiny black specks rising fast from the east. Zeros. The Japanese pilots dove head-on, their confidence still rooted in the superiority they had enjoyed since 1941. But what they didn't know was that the game had changed. The Hellcat pilots held altitude. They didn't turn. Instead, they dove. Gravity and horsepower became their allies. The Zeros tried to follow, but their controls stiffened and their engines screamed in protest. The Americans reversed, pulled up, and fired. In minutes, the first wave of Zeros was torn apart. 2 Hellcats were lost to anti-aircraft fire, but none to enemy fighters. The Americans had done exactly what the Akutan tests had taught them. Never turn, never linger, strike and climb. When the formation returned to the USS Essex, gun barrels were scorched and pilots' hands shook from adrenaline. The air boss met them on the deck and asked, "How did she fly?" The squadron leader grinned, like nothing they've ever seen before. The Hellcat's baptism of fire was complete, and the myth of Japanese invincibility was dead. Over the following months, the F6F Hellcat became the hammer of the Pacific Fleet. It replaced the aging F4F Wildcat on the Navy's large carriers and spread through the ranks like wildfire. The pilots who once dreaded facing the Zero now volunteered for combat. At Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Truk Lagoon, Hellcats swept the skies clean before the first Marines even landed. In those chaotic island-hopping battles, control of the air meant everything. Each sortie determined whether soldiers lived or died on the beaches below. The results were staggering. By early 1944, Hellcat squadrons had claimed more than 2,000 kills, with losses so minimal that commanders initially refused to believe the reports. And yet, behind every victory was a clear pattern. Every tactic, every maneuver traced its roots to one moment in 1942 when Eddie Sanders took that first flight in the captured Zero. The Hellcat's strength was not just its speed or firepower. It was forgiveness. Pilots could slam it onto a carrier deck, clip a wing on a wave, or take cannon fire through the fuselage, and still fly home. Grumman's engineers had built it to absorb punishment. The plane's thick armor plating could stop a 20mm shell that would have shredded a Zero to ribbons. One pilot, Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu, described his experience after returning from a mission over the Philippines. "I got hit 3, maybe 4 times. My wing was leaking fuel like a faucet. But the Hellcat just kept flying. That airplane wanted to live. That toughness wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. The Hellcat gave pilots something far more powerful than armor: confidence. Where the early war Wildcats had been outperformed in every category, the Hellcat flipped the equation. In a straight fight, it was faster, stronger, and deadlier. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns could shred a Zero in seconds, and its roll rate and climb speed meant it dictated when and how a battle began. As the months passed, Japan's losses mounted at a pace they couldn't sustain. In 1942, Japan had fielded some of the best pilots in the world, veterans from China and Pearl Harbor. But by 1944, those men were gone. Replacements were rushed through abbreviated training programs, sent into battle with barely 100 flight hours, facing American pilots with double that. The F6F Hellcat turned this imbalance into annihilation. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19, 1944, the full measure of that transformation would be revealed. The largest carrier battle in history was about to begin. The Japanese launched nearly 400 aircraft from 9 carriers. Their goal: to crush the American invasion fleet. Overhead, American radar detected them coming. Hellcats scrambled from 15 aircraft carriers, forming massive combat air patrols and layers of defense. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Wave after wave of Japanese planes were cut down long before reaching their targets. The Hellcats dove through formations like hawks among pigeons, their tracers painting red arcs across the blue Pacific. Out of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched, over 300 were destroyed, many without scoring a single hit on American ships. The loss was catastrophic. Japan's air arm, already struggling after Midway, was shattered beyond repair. One American pilot, watching the burning wrecks spiral into the sea, whispered into his headset, "This is it. This is the end of them." He was right. But behind the glory of victory lay something deeper, a lesson written in every Hellcat sortie. The Akutan Zero had taught the Americans how their enemy fought. It showed them that knowledge was as lethal as bullets. By dissecting that one aircraft, by understanding its limits, the U.S. Navy had built not just a fighter, but a system, a fusion of intelligence, engineering, and tactics. The Hellcat wasn't just a machine of war. It was the embodiment of what happens when data becomes doctrine, when understanding turns into supremacy. By the war's end, the numbers told the story better than any speech could. The F6F Hellcat achieved 5,163 confirmed air-to-air kills, while losing only 270 aircraft in combat, a 19-to-1 kill ratio, unmatched in aviation history. In the Pacific skies, one truth reigned supreme. The hunter had become the hunted. Every pilot who flew the Hellcat owed a silent debt to the young Japanese ensign whose crash had started it all. Tadayoshi Koga's death had given life to a weapon that would erase Japan's dominance from the air. From the Aleutian bogs to the blazing decks of the Essex, from Eddie Sanders' quiet test flights to the chaos over the Philippine Sea, it was a single thread of fate that connected them all. The Zero had once ruled the Pacific. Now its own ghost guided the weapon that destroyed it. Military metal and the skies of the Pacific would never belong to Japan again. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. At 10:23 a.m., the Pacific sky trembled. Radar operators aboard the USS Lexington picked up hundreds of enemy blips, dense, fast-moving clusters sweeping toward the American fleet from the west. The order went out across the task force. Incoming bogies, bearing 270. All hands, man battle stations. The stage was set for one of the most lopsided air battles in history, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For 3 years, Japan had dominated the skies of the Pacific. The Zero had been their symbol of invincibility. But now, the balance had reversed. On the decks of 15 American carriers stood 450 F6F Hellcats, each flown by well-trained pilots who had mastered the art of aerial warfare. The U.S. fleet's radar-guided coordination gave them what Japan never had: time. As Japanese aircraft raced across the open sea, the Hellcats were already climbing into position, forming layers of defense that stretched for miles. Commander David McCampbell, aboard the USS Essex, looked to his wingman and said quietly, "Let's make this count." He would, more than anyone else that day. At 10:36 a.m., the first wave of Val dive bombers appeared over the horizon, their silhouettes glinting in the sunlight. They dove straight toward the American fleet, escorted by Zero fighters desperate to punch through the Hellcat screen. But the U.S. pilots had learned their enemy's every weakness. When the Japanese dove, the Hellcats didn't follow. They pulled high and rolled over in a slashing attack, exploiting the Zero's poor dive recovery. What followed was carnage. Tracer rounds stitched through the sky. Flames erupted from Japanese cockpits. Planes spiraled downward, exploding into white spray across the sea. One pilot radioed in disbelief. "They're falling like ducks in hunting season." That phrase, half shock, half triumph, gave birth to the battle's immortal name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By noon, the first wave was gone. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft that attacked, only a handful made it back. But there was no rest. At 1 p.m., radar screens flashed again. A second and third wave were inbound, nearly 250 planes. The sky became chaos. Hellcats from the Lexington, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Bunker Hill soared through the clouds, engaging targets in every direction. Some pilots ran out of ammunition and began ramming enemy aircraft or using gun cameras as mock sights to bluff their opponents. McCampbell shot down 7 planes in one sortie, his wingman ensign, Roy Rushing, adding 6 more. Together, they turned the battle into legend. Below them, the fleet's anti-aircraft guns thundered. 5-inch shells detonated in midair, showering burning fragments across the waves. Every ship in the task force blazed with defensive fire, a wall of steel that no bomber could penetrate. The few Japanese planes that broke through dropped their payloads blindly, missing every major target. Not one American carrier was hit. By the time the sun dipped low that evening, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, the heart of the Imperial Navy's air arm. Only 29 Hellcats were lost. It was a massacre, not born of luck, but of evolution. For every hour the Japanese spent clinging to outdated tactics, the Americans had spent studying, analyzing, and improving. The lessons from the capture to Kutan Zero, its slow roll rate, weak dive performance, and fragile fuel lines, have been built into every Hellcat's battle plan. What once made the Zero invincible now made it vulnerable. The aftermath was grim for Japan. Their carrier decks stood empty, pilots gone, fuel reserves low. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, radioed Tokyo that night. "Our losses are overwhelming. We have no replacement pilots. The enemy controls the air." It was more than a defeat, it was a death sentence. Without air cover, Japan's carriers became floating coffins. Over the next 2 days, American dive bombers and torpedo planes hunted them down. The carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Hyo were all sent to the ocean floor. The Imperial Navy had entered the battle with 9 carriers. It left with 3 barely operational. On the American side, the mood was electric. Pilots returned to their carriers cheering, exhausted but alive. Mechanics clapped them on the back, and the decks erupted in celebration. Admiral Mark Mitchell, commander of Task Force 58, walked to the bridge and watched the sun setting behind the smoke-filled horizon. Then he removed his cap and whispered a quiet salute, not for victory, but for the men who'd fought and died to reach this point. That night, the fleet turned on its lights, an act unheard of in wartime, to guide lost pilots back home through the darkness. It was a sight so bright that sailors miles away thought dawn had come early. Out of the night sky, Hellcats limped home, wings riddled with holes, engines sputtering, but alive. Over the radio, a pilot's voice cracked through static. "This is Hellcat 19. Coming home, boys." He barely made it, landing with one wheel and no brakes. The deck crew pulled him out, grinning. The next morning, the calm sea told the story. Hundreds of oil slicks drifted across the water, each one marking the grave of a fallen Zero. Japan had lost its air supremacy forever. In Tokyo, the truth hit like a hammer. The Empire's most skilled aviators, veterans from Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway, were gone. Their replacements would never match them. Training programs were slashed, fuel shortages worsened, and aircraft production lagged under relentless U.S. bombing. The Hellcat, once a desperate experiment, had become a symbol of dominance. From the decks of the Essex-class carriers, American pilots now owned the Pacific skies. But behind every statistic was a chain of events that began years earlier in a lonely Alaskan bog. The wreck of Koga Zero, half-buried, forgotten, had unknowingly handed the United States the blueprint for air supremacy. The engineers at Grumman had studied that plane line by line, bolt by bolt, and turned it into the weapon that crushed Japan's ambitions. It was not the biggest victory of the war, but it was one of the most decisive. Because once the U.S. ruled the air, the Pacific Islands fell one by one, and Japan's empire crumbled from above. In the words of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, spoken weeks later, the enemy's defeat in the Marianas was no accident. It was the result of knowledge, courage, and the will to improve. The Hellcat had fulfilled its destiny. The 19:1 killing machine born from a captured enemy fighter had become the instrument of Japan's downfall. Military metal, and from that day forward, the rising sun would never again rise over the Pacific. October 24th, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The sun rose over Leyte Gulf, turning the horizon into molten gold. Below, a massive American invasion force churned through the waves. The beginning of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. For the men aboard those ships, the roar of engines overhead meant safety. For the Japanese, it meant the beginning of the end. The F6F Hellcat now ruled the Pacific. After the Marianas, the once feared Zero was no longer a terror. It was a target. The sky that had once belonged to Japan was now a hunting ground for America's carrier pilots. But Japan refused to surrender. Out of desperation, a new kind of weapon was born, one that terrified even veteran Hellcat pilots. They were called kamikaze, the divine wind. That morning, radar picked up a formation of enemy aircraft approaching from the northwest. The American pilots scrambled. Their Hellcats, engines roaring, lifted off the decks of the USS Essex, Enterprise, and Lexington, cutting through the dawn like steel hawks. As they climbed to intercept, they saw something strange. The Japanese planes weren't dogfighting. They were diving straight down. The first kamikaze slammed into the escort carrier USS St. Lo, detonating its fuel and bombs in a blinding fireball. Within minutes, the ship was gone, 113 men lost. It was the first successful kamikaze strike of the war. The Hellcats now faced an enemy that wanted to die. For men like Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, America's top Navy ace, the mission became even more urgent. He knew that if the Hellcats didn't destroy those kamikaze aircraft in the air, thousands of sailors below would die. On October 24th, McCampbell led a tiny flight of 7 Hellcats against an incoming wave of 60 Japanese planes near Luzon. The odds were impossible, but he didn't flinch. He throttled forward, diving into the swarm. They were everywhere, he later recalled. But I had an airplane that could climb like a rocket and dive like a stone. In 95 minutes, he shot down 9 aircraft in a single sortie, a record that still stands. His wingmen added 7 more. That day, the Hellcats prevented a massacre. The kamikazes never reached the fleet. The skies over the Philippines became a battlefield of courage and sacrifice. Hellcat pilots fought hour after hour, intercepting suicide planes before they could strike the invasion force. The cockpit glass often fogged with heat. Guns overheated. Ammunition ran low, but they kept flying. Every intercepted kamikaze meant hundreds of lives saved below. And still, Japan sent more. By late 1944, Tokyo's airfields were filled not with seasoned veterans, but with boys barely out of flight school, some as young as 17. Their aircraft were crude, their engines unreliable, but their resolve was absolute. Meanwhile, America's machine of war had reached full stride. From factories in New York, New Jersey, and California, Grumman Hellcats rolled off the assembly lines at a rate of 1 every 66 minutes. They called Grumman's plant the Iron Works because its planes came out unbreakable, and its workers refused to let pilots down. Women and men labored around the clock, writing messages on the fuselages, "Bring her home safe, sailor." And they did. As the U.S. pushed closer to Japan, the Hellcats' range, durability, and firepower made it indispensable. At Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and across the Philippine Sea ***, they cleared the skies before the bombers came. Each mission carried the weight of 2 wars. One fought above the clouds, one fought on the ground. Marines storming the beaches looked up and saw Hellcats wheeling overhead, their presence a promise that someone had their back. In the words of one Marine corporal at Iwo Jima, "When you saw those Hellcats overhead, you didn't feel alone anymore. You knew you were going to make it." By early 1945, the Japanese Air Force was in ruins. Fuel was scarce. Engines failed before takeoff. And the pilots, the heart of Japan's air might, were gone. The Zero, once feared across the Pacific, had become an antique. Against the Hellcat, it stood no chance. Admiral William Halsey, watching from the flagship USS New Jersey, summed it up simply. The Hellcat took everything the Zero taught us and turned it against them. But even in victory, there's tragedy. The kamikazes kept coming. On May 11th, 1945, a suicide plane crashed into the carrier USS Bunker Hill, killing 393 sailors. It was one of the Navy's darkest days. Still, the fleet pressed on. Hellcat pilots fought relentlessly, day and night, until the Japanese sky was empty. Each time they landed, the deck crews cheered, but the smiles were thin. They'd seen too much fire to celebrate. When the war finally reached its end in August 1945, the numbers were staggering. F6F Hellcats destroyed over 5,000 enemy aircraft, with a kill ratio of 19-1, and protected every major Pacific invasion from Tarawa to Okinawa. No other fighter in history had ever achieved that level of dominance. And yet, the story had begun with a single accident, a Zero buried in an Alaskan swamp, a dead pilot whose fate changed the world. From that wreck rose a machine that redefined air power, a machine that gave the United States not just victory, but supremacy. Every bolt, every rivet, every tactic traced back to that moment when Eddie Sanders climbed into the captured Zero and dared to understand his enemy. Knowledge had become the deadliest weapon of all. As Japan's surrender loomed, the last Hellcats flew escort missions over Tokyo Bay. On September 2nd, 1945, when the Japanese signed the official surrender aboard the USS Missouri, Hellcats circled above, silent witnesses to history. Below, the war ended. Above, the aircraft that had made that ending possible roared one final salute, a thunderous echo across the sea. The F6F Hellcat was not just a plane. It was a symbol of resilience, of learning, of transformation. It proved that victory is not born from arrogance, but from understanding. Military metal from the mud of Akutan to the fire of Okinawa. It was the Hellcat that ruled the skies and ended Japan's dream of empire. 1945 Tokyo Bay. The war was over. Below the clouds, the battleship USS Missouri sat anchored, its deck crowded with officers and photographers. At precisely 9:04 a.m., Japanese officials signed the surrender documents that ended World War II. Overhead, the sound of piston engines thundered. Formation after formation of F6F Hellcats swept across the bay, wings gleaming silver in the sunlight. A final salute from the aircraft that had crushed Japan's air power and rewritten the laws of naval warfare. The pilots didn't cheer. They just looked down through their canopies, silent, knowing what their victories had cost. Tens of thousands of men had died, but their sacrifices had ended a nightmare. The Pacific skies were theirs again. When the F6F Hellcat had first taken flight in 1942, few could have imagined what it would become. It was born from desperation, a response to the shock of Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese Zero dominated the skies. Back then, American pilots had been outclassed, outmaneuvered, and outgunned. The enemy's fighter could outclimb, outturn, and outrun almost everything the U.S. Navy had. Then came the Akutan Zero, a miracle in the mud. A single Japanese fighter, perfectly preserved after a crash landing in Alaska, captured by chance and studied in secrecy. It gave America something Japan never expected: understanding. And that understanding would end up costing Japan everything. In 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders sat in the cockpit of the captured Zero, hands trembling as he prepared for takeoff. His mission: to learn its secrets. Over weeks of flight tests, Sanders discovered what no one had known: the Zero's weaknesses. It couldn't dive fast without losing control. It couldn't roll sharply at high speeds. Its engine quit during negative G maneuvers, and it burned easily when hit. These discoveries were sent directly to Grumman engineers, men already designing the Hellcat. The result? A fighter that could do everything the Zero couldn't. It could dive steeper, roll faster, and absorb punishment that would rip a Zero apart. It was big, heavy, and powerful. The perfect weapon for young, inexperienced pilots learning to fight a veteran enemy. The Hellcat was not elegant. It was effective.